John Major's here. He is the former Prime Minister of Great Britain. He is in the United States to give a speech on behalf of Oxford University. We take this opportunity to talk to him about a lot of issues facing the world, including the war in Iraq, the British elections, the vote on the European Constitution, and other questions that are part of the great debate, not only in our country, but also in Great Britain.
It's good to have you on the program again. Tell me what you think is happening in the United Kingdom and the elections that are coming up with respect to the Tories and Labour.
It's very difficult to judge. I've never seen an election that is so difficult to form a judgment about. A range of reasons for that. Firstly, the government have now been in office for 8 years and they have to defend their own record. This is novel in recent years. But secondly, there are some curious deviations from norm. The most important is turnout. Nobody quite knows what the level of turnout will be, or whether there will be differential turnout with those who oppose the government staying at home and the opposition parties coming out to defeat them. That might be quite significant. The other area of great importance is what is actually going to happen as a result of the way the system has become distorted. And let me explain what I mean by that. The boundaries of the constituencies are now out of kilter. And as a result of that, it takes almost 1.5 times as many votes to elect a Conservative Member of Parliament as to elect a Labour member. Or to put it the other way round, if both parties got exactly the same number of votes in the election, Labour would have a significant lead in parliamentary seats. So that makes it very difficult to judge, and there are some other issues as well. Through some reason that's absolutely baffling me, a lot of our servicemen will no longer be able to vote if they're on active service overseas. Quite a lot of them.
You don't know why?
Well, I think something that should have been done by the government wasn't done by the government, but I've been travelling abroad, so I can't tell you precisely what has happened there. And secondly, there's recently been a case in which some Labour councillors have been convicted of postal vote fraud. Now, that has raised concerns about the postal vote system. And they've been exacerbated because in some of the marginal seats where there's very little difference between Labour and the Tories in terms of votes, the number of people registering for a postal vote has tripled, or in some cases quadrupled. Now, this may well simply be a changed culture of how people vote. That may well be the answer, and I hope it is. But I think people will look very carefully at that when those results come out.
Is this election more of a referendum on Tony Blair than it is some surge to Michael Howard?
Well, it's always a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, it's always a referendum on the incumbent government. Except in very, very rare circumstances. So yes, to a large extent it's that. But it's also a combination of what policies people are producing. The Labour Party are not really defending their record. They're conducting the campaign by attacking what they claim was the Tories' previous record up to 20 years ago. And the Conservatives...
They're running against Margaret Thatcher, they're running against you?
Well, they're running against Margaret and me.
Yeah.
I mean, they're saying that Michael Howard is a Thatcherite, he was a member of her government, he carried out her policies, and so they're raising those questions. Now, that's quite extraordinary for a government that's been in power for 8 years to essentially run their campaign against two previous Conservative governments, rather than presenting their own policies for the future. Michael Howard is now producing some very far-ranging policies. For example, in the last few days, one of the big problems we have in the UK, as you have in most countries, is future security and retirement for elderly people. And he's produced a policy that will enable people to save and get tax rebates, providing their savings go into pension provision. Now, he's producing long-term policies like that. If they register with the electorate, they should be very effective. But it's very difficult to read. In all the elections I've been involved in since 1970, I have never known an election that is more difficult to judge as to the outcome than this one.
And it's because of what, though? Because there is no overriding issue. It's not a question of the credibility of Tony Blair. It's not a question of...
There's no single overriding issue.
For or against the war.
Well, they're all issues, but there's no single overriding issue. The principal points are the ones I touched again. We're normally used to a turnout of 75 to 80%. It could be plus or minus 60% is the best judgment we can make. That's a big difference from what historically has happened. And secondly, the opinion polls are all over the place. Some of them have given Labour quite a significant lead yesterday. Others gave the Tories a lead yesterday. So something is going wrong. Either the public are more than usually volatile, or alternatively the sampling is wrong in the opinion polls, and frankly nobody knows.
What does the former Prime Minister think?
I think that the election will be a good deal closer in terms of votes than most people imagine.
So it's not a question of how big Labour's margin will be or how tiny its margin will be. You think that the Conservatives could win, the Tories could win this election?
I think the Tories could certainly win this election. I think it is certainly possible they'll get more votes than Labour. Whether that translates into more seats may depend upon how the system works. It will be quite possible for the Conservatives to get considerably more votes than Labour, but fewer seats than Labour.
Labour is an interesting party because of the relationship between Tony Blair on the one hand and Gordon Brown on the other. Does that help them, hurt them? Does the public see them as...
Well, I think most people think that their attitudes to politics are quite different, and their instincts are quite different, and there seems very little doubt. I suppose I would say that. You must lay off for that. Sure. I would say this. But it seems to me there are quite substantial differences between them, and I think the public see that.
They have different policies and believe in different things, and then within the umbrella of the Labour Party.
I think they have different objectives. I mean, Tony Blair is very much New Labour. Right. Gordon Brown, to a substantial extent, stands for the old traditional virtues of Labour. Now, they're quite different. They're quite different. And it will be interesting to see over the period of the next 5 or 10 years which strand of the Labour Party predominates.
Tories supported the war for the most part. Tony Blair supported the war. Tony Blair got into a lot of trouble, but it seems to be not about the war, but about whether he, in what he said, misled the country?
That's entirely right. I think there was broad support for the war. I mean, he was always in a very secure position because the Conservative Party, the principal opposition party, supported the war and supported the Prime Minister in going to war. So the opposition to Tony Blair is not because of his support for the United States, emphatically not. It is not really for his support for the war. Again, that is not the point at issue. The point at issue is whereas a fairly broad-ranging case for the war was put in the United States, a whole series of different reasons for going to war. In the United Kingdom, it was predominantly because there were, it was said, as a matter of fact, weapons of mass destruction. And secondly, that these weapons of mass destruction were a positive danger to the United Kingdom. At one stage, just before a crucial parliamentary vote, there were stories that the Iraqis could hit the United Kingdom in 45 minutes. Well, that was patent nonsense. It was always patent nonsense. Everybody knew it was patent nonsense who'd been anywhere near government. Government didn't correct that. They had 100 opportunities to say, no, 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 this is a mistake. They didn't do so. And subsequently, of course, when it has become apparent to the whole country that that was nonsense, there's been a great deal of concern about the information they were given in the lead up to the war. The assumption, I think, by everybody was that the Prime Minister knew more about weapons of mass destruction than he was able to say.
Meaning what? That he knew that they were not there?
No, that he had information that made it clear they were there, that for security reasons he couldn't divulge.
Right.
That's what most people thought, that the information was better than he was...
At the time.
At the time. That the information was better, that they had weapons of mass destruction, than he was able to say. That was the predominant view.
And that's the view he wanted them to believe?
Well, I can't, you must judge his motives, I can't do that. But what became apparent afterwards, not that he had more information saying that the weapons of mass destruction were there, but that he had less. And the combination of that and the enormous disillusionment over the 45-minute claim has led people to wonder at the information they were given in the run-up to the war. So emphatically, the concern that people have with the Prime Minister about that is not an anti-American feeling.
But can Howard make that point and gain from that point?
Well, I think he is making that point, but the election's about a good deal more than that. I don't think Michael Howard has to make that point. The election's
just there.
It's there. It's there. And this election is about the next 5 years. It's not necessarily about the last 5 years. So I think Michael Howard is right to talk about the things that are going to matter in the future, like pensions, like health, like education, like taxation. I mean, taxes have gone up pretty significantly in the last few years, but subliminally. And by that, I mean they haven't...
Even though Blair says he's New Labour.
Well, he's not that New Labour. The taxes have gone up not on income so much, but on almost everything else, and far faster than any government for 25 or 30 years. And that is just beginning just beginning to become apparent. So there are quite sharp differences there. And I think Michael Howard would be wise to concentrate on those differences, and that is what he's doing.
Some are saying, and writing this, and I know you've seen it, is that Michael Howard is taking a leaf from George Bush's campaign strategy. And there's much talk about values, there's much talk about faith, there's much talk about those qualities having to do with the soul of a nation. What does Britain stand for?
Well, Michael has been talking about these issues for the 25 years that I've known him. So it certainly isn't something he's just taken on because it turned out to be successful in the United States. These are issues that have concerned Michael for a very long time, and he is presenting...
What's the issue then, and within the rubric of values and faith and what it means to, what would the national identity of Britain?
Well, I think there are a range of things, a range of different things. I mean, in terms of the national identity, you cannot divorce that from the European argument, and particularly the question of a European constitution.
I want to get to that in a moment.
Yeah, well, it's partly that. It's partly belief that the centre is once again gaining too much power at the expense of the regions, that the state is getting too much power at the expense of the individual, that taxation means that the government are making too many decisions for the individual. It's the classic old Tory argument that small government is better than big government because it leaves more room for people to determine their own lives in their own environment. That's essentially the argument, and it's presented in a range of different ways.
What's going to happen in France, do you believe, on
the referendum?
On the referendum on the Constitution. That Chirac went on television, national television, because he believes evidently it's in trouble.
Well, I think there's no doubt it's in trouble. I mean, a whole series of opinion polls have shown, the last 12 or 13, I think, have shown the referendum being lost in France. Now, historically, France has been the maypole around which Europe danced. So it would be a very severe blow to the European cause if this referendum were lost in France. It could be lost in other countries, and you could recover the situation. If it's lost in France, this constitution, as it stands today, is a dead duck. So there's a great...
If it loses in France, this constitution is a dead duck put together by Giscard d'Estaing and others.
That's right. That's right. I mean, Europe would probably come back and try and produce something similar, but not immediately.
But what does it mean if this constitution is dead? What does this mean for the future of Europe?
Well, let's first...
The idea of Europe.
Well, that is what is unclear. I mean, there are a number of things that are unclear at the moment. Europe has just expanded its membership to 25 nations, from 15 to 25. That is a huge change. It's now seeking to produce an overarching constitution. As yet, Europe has 2 or 3 things that it doesn't know how to deal with. It isn't competitive enough. Europe spends too much time thinking, how does France compete with Germany, compete with Spain, compete with Italy? They should be wondering, how can Europe compete with the United States and Asia?
Right.
And they're not. That's the first problem they have. The second problem they have is they've expanded the European Union from 15 to 25 nations. They're not sure how they're going to govern such a vast area of so many diverse nations with diverse economies. They don't know the answer to that. And thirdly, if they lose the constitution, they're going to have to go back and rethink a great deal of what they have considered about how they govern Europe in future. So the outcome of this referendum in France is very important. It looks, at the moment, as though it may be defeated.
In your judgment, is the euro successful?
I think the euro is... I think, firstly, let me say, I think the euro, that the euro was formed at the wrong time for the wrong reasons.
And said so.
And in the wrong circumstances, and I said so. That said, I think it has been pretty successful. It has certainly helped bring the European economies together. And that is quite important if you're going to make Europe more competitive. Many people don't like it. Britain are not in it. And I do not think Britain will go in the euro in the next 5 or 6 years. Not a hope in hell of going in. But broadly, it's been successful. When the euro was formed, it traded at too low an exchange rate because a vast amount of money left Europe and went into the United States.
As all of us found out, it traveled in Europe
as all of you found out.
And now we're coming to a...
Now you're seeing exactly the reverse. Now you're seeing exactly the reverse because the dollar has fallen. Well, it was not all that long ago against sterling. It was 140. It's now 190 today. So the dollar has fallen dramatically and the euro has risen beyond the level that is credible when you consider how the European economies are performing. So the euro is stronger than the economic fundamentals suggest it ought to be at the moment. But it has established itself as a currency.
But the European economy seems to be sick too. I mean, they just revised today, as we speak, what they expect to be the economic growth rate for Europe
I agree
for 2005.
Yes, no, I think that's right. I think the European economy is sick. It's the competitive point I made a moment ago. You have a culture in Europe towards social expenditure. Well, that is very praiseworthy, and everybody wishes to have security and support for people in difficulties. That's not in doubt. Every civilized nation wishes to do that. But the point is, if you do that, you need the competitiveness to increase the growth, to raise the taxes, to pay for that social support. Now, Europe haven't done that, and that is the principal problem they have. Their economies need a substantial amount of structural reform in order to make themselves as competitive as they could be, and they're not doing that. And that is why Germany in particular, and that is largely because of the problems of taking on East Germany, which were much greater than they realized. But France also, those two big European economies are both facing difficulties at the moment, and that is dragging down the European growth rate as a whole.
Tell me how you see us today, us being the United States, and both in terms of how we are, the role we ought to play in the world, the American economy, and this whole emphasis now on democracy in the Middle East.
Well, the last time I had a question like that, somebody said black holes in space discuss. Let me try and pick up those points.
I'll come back to you in 30 minutes. Yeah.
The fundamental difference now from 15 years ago is that 15 years ago you had two superpowers and the world lined up broadly, either behind the Soviet Union or behind the United States. Right. Now, economically, militarily, and politically, the United States stands alone. She is, by a measured country mile, the most powerful nation compared to all other nations in the world than you have ever seen at any stage in history. Not even the Roman Empire had an economic and military dominance over the rest of the world that the United States has. Now, that's the first point you have to realize, because many of the people whom Americans perceive as being opposed to them are not really opposed to America. They are actually concerned that America is so much primus inter pares, so much more powerful than everybody else.
But let me interrupt you, ask one that's right on target there. Do you think that a country with so much economic power and so much political power and so much standing alone, as you suggested, with more power than even more so than the Roman Empire, has any genuine global ambitions to dominate the world?
No, I don't think America has any ambitions to dominate the world. America isn't an aggressive external
and that's unique in history too, isn't it? I mean, to have a country that powerful with no great strategy.
It is pretty much unique in history, yes.
Let me interrupt again and have you speak to that issue, but there are those who say China, a coming economic power, also doesn't have a global strategy to dominate the world.
I don't think China has an aggressive global strategy. I mean, if you take China, within 30 years, or 25 years, the three greatest nation-state economies in the world will be the United States, China, and India. Right. Don't forget India. India is coming along very quickly, and it's huge.
And fourth may be either Japan or Europe, or will be Japan.
Well, Europe collectively may be as big as any of the other three, but I was referring to nation-states. Japan, well, Japan has been silted up for 10 years. We'll see what Japan does in the next 10 or 15 years.
I interrupted you. Go ahead.
But I don't think either the United States or China are likely to be aggressive powers seeking conquest.
And so there's no inevitability that these two countries will somehow come into some kind of terrible conflict.
Well, it's a curious conflict at the moment, isn't it? China is effectively funding the United States deficit, right, and United States investment is promoting Chinese growth. There's a very interesting...
They're locked in an embrace that's not necessarily good for... It's both good, but not necessarily good. Most people think that the current accounts deficit and the trade imbalance, which is $180 billion a year.
Yeah, it's huge, and I would very much, I think the whole world would like to see those twin imbalances reduced. But the fact of the matter is they are locked in a commercial embrace, infinitely better than the Cold War situation where the Soviet Union and America were locked in a nuclear and into an antagonistic nuclear embrace. Much better. And I don't think China is going to be aggressive for this particular reason. Firstly, because historically she hasn't been an aggressive nation striking out for her borders, and she's a very ancient nation, but historically she hasn't done that. But more relevantly, the sheer scale of growth in China is extraordinary. We've not seen anything like this before. And yet, if you suddenly move from a communist system to a quasi-capitalist system, you bring with it not only the advantages of capitalism, but the problems of capitalism. And China are going to have those. They're already having them. Vast movement of population from the rural areas to the cities. Problems of how they provide sufficient water. Problems of how they find sufficient energy. The problems of people demanding a social security system. The problems of the regions saying, well, we in Shanghai really don't wish to be told entirely what to do by Beijing. Right. For there is an irony here for China. In order for China to continue to grow as she has been doing, she has to shed authority to the regions. If she sheds authority to the regions, it is difficult for the present quasi-communist regime to retain the levels of control that it's had at the moment. So this is a very different China from any we have known in our lifetimes.
So its issues may be more internal than external.
I think China will be concentrating predominantly on internal matters over the next 10 or 15 years. I mean, she is building up her military, no question about that. But I don't think that is something that the United States should get themselves in a great flap about. The gap between anything China is likely to produce militarily in the next 25 years and what the United States has now is going to be massive. There's no need to fear a military threat.
Their aggressiveness with respect to the economic frontier leaves a lot to be admired, I mean, in terms of how they're going out to tie up oil resources and oil contracts.
America is very aggressive economically. They're very tough competitors. If you're chasing a contract from Europe with the United States, they play fairly, but they play hardball. They're tough competitors. And the Chinese are tough competitors. This isn't a Mary Poppins world. This is a tough world. And so I don't think we can object to China being tough. Europe is, America is, Britain is, Japan is. That's the way of the world.
Because they're in competition for markets as well as resources.
Well, yes, maybe resources first and markets second, because you need the resources to produce.
The democracy idea, I mean, I've interrupted you when you were talking about America having no great global need to dominate, but at the same time being economically aggressive. Democracy is one keystone of the Bush foreign policy. Where is it going to go?
I think there's a limit to how far you can export democracy. What is seen as democratic in Western Europe or the United States is seen through slightly different eyes elsewhere. But I think many of the same principles are broadly true. And you clearly have Iraq in the back of your mind. And Iraq it's still unclear what is going to happen in Iraq. A government has been formed. You have a Kurd as president, a Sunni and a Shia as vice president. This is a good start. But it's only setting up a structure that will then have to deal with the problems. But pitch it forward if, and I say if this proves to be successful and you establish a democracy in Iraq, you've got a democracy in Iraq next door to an established democracy in Turkey, you may well be a long way along the road to changing the face of the Middle East if you can make Iraq an effective democracy.
And what's the likelihood or the probability of that happening?
Well, I think it's much too early to say.
But it's better than 50-50 by now?
Well, I don't know that I can say that. I think it is. The elections were far more successful than most people believed. And many people...
So it may have tipped it in the right direction.
I think it has pointed it in the right direction. But if you recall, a Chinese leader went to Paris in the early 1980s, and somebody said to him, was the French Revolution a good idea? And he said, it's too early to say. And it's too...
Zhou Enlai.
It's Zhou Enlai. It's too early to say with Iraq yet. There's a lot still to happen before we know whether this has been successful. So far, so good, but there's a lot still to be done.
There's also this word that gets used a lot lately, vindication. Do you think that the election is a vindication of the regime change in Iraq and the war in Iraq?
Well, I think it goes towards being a vindication, but I think the vindication will be the final outcome of what has happened, and we're some way short of that yet.
So the jury is out as to whether that was a wise move on the part of the United States?
Well, there are a range of reasons for that war. Although no weapons of mass destruction were found after the war, I am in no doubt from the time I was Prime Minister years ago that they did have weapons of mass destruction at one stage. No question, because they used them, apart from anything else. And it is quite extraordinary if they'd shed them that they weren't prepared to say so. So I think if the war turns out eventually, when history casts its baleful eye on it, to have been on a misjudgment. It's a misjudgment that was created as much by the Iraqi regime as by anybody else. But I think when you come to vindication, you have to look at what the outcome is going to be. And as yet, we don't know what the outcome is.
Have I missed anything that's on your mind that you think it's important for all of us because of your experience, because of who you see, who you talk to, the ideas that you are engaged in? Yeah. I mean, clearly energy is important, clearly the environment is important, we know that, but they go into the economy. China and India's rise is important. What happens in Europe is important. The Middle East and democracy is important. Is there any other thing that you think we in America and people who do what I do ought to take cognizance of?
Yeah, there is, if I may say so. I think you should look more carefully at what is happening to a large part of the world in terms of poverty. And I don't say that from an especially liberal position, but from a very practical position. 1/2 of the world, 3 billion people, live on less than $2 a day. 1/5 of the world live on less than $1 a day, US dollar a day. Within the next 20 years, the world's population of 6 billion will be 8 billion. Of the extra 2 billion people, 97% are going to live in that part of the world that has less than $2 a day. Now, if the first responsibility of a government is to hand something better and more secure to the next generation, and I believe it is, unless we begin to tackle this problem with more vigor than we have in the past, we're going to hand an incredibly difficult problem to the next generation, and I think we should look at that much more seriously. We do spend $50 billion on overseas aid collectively.
Right.
It's an enormous sum. I think you'd agree that. But it isn't an enormous sum when you realize that America and Europe on their own spend $350 billion, 7 times as much, on subsidizing cheap food. We're spending 7 times as much subsidizing cheap food for people who are broadly well-fed than we provide for the rest of the world for people who have empty bellies. Now, I think we have to look at that, because otherwise, firstly, the discontent and the resentment of the have-nots for the haves will not make life easy for the next generation. And secondly, unless we address that problem, it may get so big that it cannot be addressed by future generations. And that is just not sensible politically and is not right morally.
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
Pleasure to have you on the broadcast again. John Major, former Prime Minister of Great Britain. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
Funding for Charlie Rose has been provided by the following.